Maya Collins opened her eyes and saw fire dancing across twisted metal above her head, and smoke filled her lungs as she coughed hard, trying to breathe clean air, but finding none, and her body ached in ways she had never felt before, and she knew something had gone terribly wrong with the mission. The reconnaissance vessel had been her home for 3 months. As she surveyed the Outer Rim planets, and Varith Prime was supposed to be simple and quick and boring like all the others. But then, the energy field had appeared from nowhere and ripped through the ship like paper, and she remembered screaming as the controls died in gravity. Failed, and everything went dark now. She lay in the wreckage somewhere on an alien world, and her survival. This suit had kept her alive, but the helmet display was cracked and useless, and she could not contact anyone in the emergency. Beacon was silent and dead, and Maya realized with cold certainty that nobody was coming to save. Hershey pushed herself up. Slowly, and pain shot through her left arm, but nothing seemed broken, and she climbed out of the destroyed cockpit into a forest unlike anything Earth had ever produced, and the trees were made of crystal that glowed with soft purple light, and the ground beneath her boots was covered in silver moss that rippled when she stepped on it like water. Sky above showed 3 moons hanging in twilight that seemed permanent, and no sun visible anywhere, and the air tasted strange but breathable, and carried sounds that made her skin crawl with instinct, screaming danger. And Maya checked her sidearm and found it still holstered and functional, and that small comfort helped steady her nerves. She needed to find shelter and water and figure out where she was and how to survive until rescue came, if rescue came at all. And the thought of dying alone on this beautiful alien world made her chest tight with fear. She refused to acknowledge. Maya walked for what felt like hours through the crystalline forest, and her suit computer was damaged but still tracking basic data and showed her moving roughly north toward what might be higher ground and better vantage points to signal for help. Then she heard it, and the sound froze her in place, because it was not wind or animals, but something breathing and large and close enough that she could feel heat in the air. And Maya turned slowly with her hand on her weapon and saw the dragon. It was coiled around a massive crystal tree with scales that shifted between black and deep purple and caught the twilight in ways that hurt to look at directly, and its eyes were ancient and knowing and fixed on her with intelligence that was undeniable. And Maya had seen plenty of alien creatures in her career, but nothing that radiated power like this. Being the dragon did not move and did not attack, and simply watched her with those eyes that seemed to see through her skin into her soul. And Maya felt small and fragile and utterly outmatched. Then she appeared and stepped out from behind the dragon with silver hair that moved like liquid light, even though there was no wind, and skin that seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, and eyes that held colors Maya had no names for, and she was beautiful in a way that made Maya forget how to breathe. The woman wore armor that looked grown rather than forged, and it flowed over her body like water turned solid, and she carried no visible weapons. But Maya knew instantly that this being was more dangerous than any gun, and the way she moved spoke of centuries of training and power barely contained. Maya raised her hands slowly to show she meant no harm, and tried to remember the basic variant phrases from her training, but her mind went blank under that otherworldly gaze, and all she could think was that she was about to die, and nobody would ever know what happened to her. The woman studied her for a long moment, and then spoke in a voice that sounded like music, and Maya did not understand the words, but felt their weight and meaning somehow, and the woman seemed curious rather than hostile, and that gave Maya hope. She tried speaking in standard, said her name and rank, and explained that she had crashed and needed help, and the woman tilted her head, listening, and Maya wondered how much she understood. The dragon rumbled deep in its chest, and the sound vibrated through the ground and made the crystal trees chime softly, and the woman placed one hand on its scales in a gesture of reassurance, and Maya realized they were bonded somehow, and the dragon was not a pet, but a partner and equal. The woman gestured for Maya to follow and turned to walk deeper into the forest, and Maya hesitated because following could be a trap. But staying meant dying slowly in the wilderness, and the choice was not really a choice at all. They walked in silence through terrain that grew more difficult, and Maya struggled to keep up with the woman who moved through the forest like she was part of it and knew every route and stone, and never stumbled or slowed. Maya was focused on her footing when the ground suddenly shifted, and she felt herself falling forward and tried to catch herself. But her injured arm gave out, and she tumbled straight into the woman, and their lips met in a collision that lasted only a heartbeat time. Seemed to stop, and Maya felt electricity surge through her entire body and saw colors that should not exist and heard music that had no source in every way. Nerve-ending blazed with sensation that was not quite pain and not quite pleasure, but something beyond both. The woman caught her and steadied her, and their eyes met, and Maya saw shock reflected there that matched her own, and something else that looked like recognition and fear and wonder all mixed together. The woman whispered something in her language, and her voice was barely audible, but Maya heard it clearly and felt the words settle into her bones like they belonged there, and even though she did not know Varen, she somehow understood the meaning once more. Maya stepped back quickly, and her face burned with embarrassment, and she started to apologize, but the woman raised one hand to silence her and looked at Maya with an expression that was impossible to read, and the dragon watched them both with what might have been amusement in its ancient eyes. The woman turned and walked faster now, and Maya followed in confused silence and tried to understand what had just happened and why her body still tingled with aftershocks of that brief contact, and why she felt connected to this stranger in ways that made no sense. They reached a cliff face, and the woman touched the stone, and it opened like a door, revealing a passage that glowed with the same purple light as the forest and led deep into the mountain, and Maya followed because there was nothing else to do inside. The mountain was a place that took her breath away, and chambers carved from living crystal and filled with technology that blended organic and mechanical in ways human science could not achieve, and furniture that seemed to grow from the floor and walls covered in symbols that hurt to look at too long. The woman finally spoke again, and this time Maya understood somehow, and the words appeared in her mind as meaning rather than sound, and the woman said her name was Kelith, and she was princess of the Varen Dominion, and this was her hidden sanctuary away from the eyes of her people. Maya felt panic rising because she knew what Virans were in the Cold War that had frozen the border between their space and human space for decades, and all the reports of how dangerous they were, and how different, and how they could never be trusted. Kelith seemed to read her thoughts and explained that she was not a threat, and that Maya crashing here was no accident, and that something had brought them together for a reason that neither of them understood. Yet the dragon followed them inside and settled near a thermal vent and regarded Maya with those knowing eyes, and Kelith placed her hand on Maya's shoulder, and the touch sent another jolt through her system, and Maya jerked away. Instinctively, Elith looked sad and explained something that made Maya's blood run cold, and the accidental kiss was not simple contact, but a ritual among her people, and a soul mark that bound two beings together across space and time and reality itself. Maya demanded to know what that meant, and Kelith explained that they were linked now and could sense each other's emotions and location, and eventually thoughts, and the bond could not be broken by distance or death, and would last beyond the ending of stars. Maya felt her world tilting and asked why Kelith had not warned her, and Kelith said it happened too fast and was impossible to predict. And among her people, such bonds were sacred and rare and never occurred by accident. The princess explained that her people had been preparing for war with humanity, and that her own mother led the faction pushing for conflict, and that Kelith had been searching for another path. And now she was bound to a human, and if anyone discovered it, both of them would be executed as traitors. Maya sank onto a chair that adjusted itself to her body and tried to process everything, and her mind raced with implications, and she thought of her sister Katie serving on the border, and all the people who would die if war came. Kelith knelt before her and took her hands, and Maya felt warmth spread from the contact, and the princess said they had little time, and that forces on both sides wanted war, and that Maya's crash had been engineered by someone, and that they needed to understand why the dragon spoke then. And its voice filled the chamber like thunder, and Maya understood it somehow through the bond, and it said that darkness was coming, and that only together could they stop it, and that the accidental kiss might be the one thing that could save both their species from extinction. Maya looked into Kelith's eyes and saw fear and hope and determination, and felt the bond between them humming like a living thing, and knew that her life. Maya spent 3 days in the Starfall Citadel learning things that rewrote everything she thought she knew about the galaxy, and Keleth taught her the basic meditation techniques that helped control the soulmark bond, and without them Maya would have drowned in the constant flow of emotions from the princess. The Citadel hummed with ancient power that made her teeth ache, and Keleth explained that it was built on a convergence point where multiple dimensions touched, and that was why it remained hidden from detection, and why the Varens had first settled this world millennia ago. The dragon spent most of his time in the deepest chambers, where the heat was greatest, and sometimes Maya felt his presence in her mind like distant thunder, and she was learning that he was far more than a simple companion to Kelethan. The third night, Keleth brought Maya to a chamber filled with holographic displays that showed ship movements across the border and fleet buildups on both sides, and the data made Maya sick because she could see the pattern forming and recognized it from military history and knew that war was maybe weeks away. Eth pointed to specific movements and explained that someone was coordinating actions on both sides and pushing humanity and Varens toward conflict, and it was too organized to be accidental and too precise to be simple paranoia. Maya asked who would benefit from their species destroying each other, and Keleth's face grew darkened. She spoke of the architects and beings from outside normal space who fed on conflict and had been manipulating galactic events for Yansta. Princess showed Maya ancient records that had been hidden away and suppressed by both governments, and the records spoke of previous cycles where species rose to power and then tore themselves apart, and always at the crucial moment the architects appeared to feast on the chaos. Maya wanted to dismiss it as mythology, but the evidence was overwhelming. It included sensor data from unexplained phenomena and testimony from survivors who had seen things that should not exist, and genetic markers in both human and Varen DNA that suggested intentional manipulation. Keleth revealed that the Varens were not a naturally evolved species, but had been created by the architects as weapons against an older threat, and that the Varens had rebelled and sealed their creators away at terrible cost, and now humanity's arrival was weakening those seals. Maya felt the bond flare with Keleth's emotions and tasted the princess's fear and guilt and determination. And it was becoming harder to tell where Maya's feelings ended and Keleth's began. She asked about the soul mark and why it was happening, and Keleth explained that such bonds were once common when Varens lived in small tribes and had helped them survive in a hostile galaxy, but over time as civilization grew, the bonds became rare and now only appeared in times of great need. The princess touched Maya's face gently and said the bond chose them for a reason, and that perhaps they were meant to bridge the gap between their species and show that
cooperation was possible. Maya
felt herself leaning into the touch and wanting more and then pulled back sharply because this was happening too fast, and she barely knew this woman, and the bond was confusing everything. Clef looked hurt but nodded and gave Maya space and said she understood, and that the bond did not mean they had to act on every feeling it created that night. Maya could not sleep and wandered the citadel and found Ashkire in a chamber carved from black crystal, and the dragon regarded her with those ancient eyes and spoke directly into her mind. He told her that he was a primordial and one of the first beings to exist in this dimension, and that he had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations and had been waiting for this moment for longer than her species had existed. Maya asked what moment, and Ashkire explained that there was a weapon hidden on Vareth Prime and a device called the Eclipse Gate that could seal the architects away forever and end their cycle of manipulation and death. She asked why nobody had used it before, and the dragon showed her visions of what the gate required, and Maya saw two souls bound together, feeding their combined essence into ancient machinery, and watched them dissolve into pure energy as reality rewrote itself around them. The price was oblivion and complete erasure from existence, and no afterlife or rebirth, and just ceasing to be. And Maya felt cold horror wash through her. Ashkir that he was bound to the gate as well, and that his sacrifice was also required, and that he had been guardian and key both, and had searched for millennia for beings worthy of this burden. Maya asked if he had chosen them, and the dragon said no. and that the bond chose itself and responded to compatibility and need, and that Maya and Keleth together had the potential to succeed where others had failed. She asked what happened if they refused, and Ashkire showed her visions of war spreading across systems and billions dying, and the architects breaking free to consume entire galaxies, and civilization collapsing into an age of darkness that would last until the heat death of the universe. Maya returned to her quarters shaking, and found Keleth waiting, and the princess had felt her distress through the bond and wanted to help. And Maya told her everything the dragon had said. Keleth was silent for a long time, and then admitted she had suspected something like this and that. Ashkire had been preparing her for years with cryptic warnings and lessons, and now she understood. When Maya asked if Keleth was willing to sacrifice herself, and the princess said she would do whatever was necessary to save her people, but that she was terrified and did not want to die, and especially did not want to simply cease existing. They held each other that night, and Maya felt the bond settling deeper and intertwining their hearts, and she knew that whatever happened, they would face it. Together, the next morning brought disaster, and Keleth's private communications array detected a message that had been sent from the Citadel without her knowledge, and someone had betrayed their location. They had maybe hours before Verone forces arrived, and Maya would be captured or killed, and Keleth would be dragged before the High Council. To answer for binding herself to a human, Keleth moved fast and gathered supplies and weapons and ancient artifacts she said they would need, and Ashkire prepared to fly, and Maya strapped herself into a harness on the dragon's back and tried not to think about how insane this was. They launched from the mountain as the first ships appeared in the sky, and Ashkire moved through space in ways that defied physics and folded distance and appeared hundreds of miles away. In an instant, Maya felt the bond stretching and snapping back as they moved, and realized, as she could always sense, Keleth's direction and distance and emotional state, and it was disorienting and comforting all at once. They flew toward the Undercity and ancient ruins that predated both their civilizations, and Keleth said they would find answers there and allies who had been working in secret to prevent the war. The ruins rose from a desert of black sand, and the structures were built from materials that seemed to shift between solid and liquid, and covered in symbols that made Maya's eyes watered. They landed, and Ashkire folded his wings, and Maya climbed down on shaky legs, and Keleth took her hand and squeezed and said they needed to trust each other completely. Now inside the ruins they found people waiting, and humans in modified combat armor, and Varens in civilian clothes, and all of them armed and watching the entrance nervously. A woman stepped forward, and Maya recognized her instantly in Commander Lisa Torres had been her training instructor years ago, and was supposed to be stationed 3 systems away. Lisa smiled grimly and said she had been part of the resistance for 2 years and working to expose the conspiracy, and that Maya had been chosen for the survey mission specifically because Lisa knew she could be trusted. Maya felt betrayed and used and angry, but also relieved because finally someone else understood what was happening. Verone Male approached, and Keleth gasped and ran to embrace him, and through the bond Maya felt overwhelming joy and relief and grief, and the man was Lord Varen, and Keleth's brother, who had supposedly died years ago. Varen explained that he had faked his death to go underground and investigate the architects, and that he had found evidence of their influence throughout both governments and military structures, and that stopping them would require actions that looked like treason. The resistance numbered maybe 200 people total, and scattered across a dozen worlds, and they had been gathering intelligence and sabotaging weapon shipments and trying to slow the march toward. Or Lisa showed Maya files that proved her crash had been arranged by Admiral Helen Carter, and one of the most decorated officers in the human fleet, and Carter had been acting strangely for months, and her orders no longer made strategic sense. Keleth shared similar evidence about High Counselor Nixera, who had been pushing hardest for war, and had been making secret deals with fringe groups and stockpiling weapons in forbidden zones. Resistance believed both leaders had been compromised by the architects and were puppets working to ensure maximum bloodshed. Varen brought them to a chamber filled with ancient computers and showed them the full prophecy about the Eclipse Gate and the soul-marked pair who would activate it, and Maya read the translated text with growing dread. The prophecy spoke of the human who walks in starlight, and The princess who defies destiny and two souls who would save both species or doom them, and the price they would pay would echo across eternity. Maya asked if there was another way, and Varen said they had searched. The attack came during the strategy meeting when they were planning the route to the Eclipse Gate, and the walls of the ancient chamber exploded inward. And figures poured through that moved wrong and seemed to flicker between solid and shadow. Maya fired her weapon on instinct, and the energy bolts passed through some of the attackers like they were not fully present, and others took the hits and kept coming, and their faces were familiar but twisted into expressions of hungry emptiness. Nesclith moved faster than Maya could track, and the princess had drawn weapons that looked like crystallized light and cut through the attackers with precision that spoke of centuries of training. The resistance fighters formed defensive positions, but they were outnumbered, and the attackers seemed to know their tactics and anticipated their moves, and Maya realized these things had once been soldiers on both sides. One of the attackers lunged at Maya, and she recognized the face under the corruption. And Captain Nicole Grant had been reported killed 6 months ago in a border incident, but here she was, moving like a puppet on strings. Maya could not shoot her friend and hesitated, and Nicole's hand wrapped around her throat with inhuman strength and lifted her off the ground, and Maya saw nothing but emptiness in those familiar Asashkir. Roared, and the sound shattered crystal pillars, and the dragon's breath was not fire but something that bent space, and the attackers near him simply ceased to exist. And Cole dropped Maya and turned toward the dragon and was consumed by that terrible breath, and Maya felt sick because, whatever Nicole had become, she was still human. Underneath, Keleth grabbed Maya and pulled her toward a back passage and shouted for everyone to retreat deeper into the Undercity, and the resistance fighters fell back, and organized Shausvarine stayed behind to seal the passage, and Maya saw through the bond how much Keleth wanted to go back for her brother, but knew they could not stop. They ran through tunnels that seemed to go on forever, and the walls were covered in more of those painful symbols, and Maya felt the bond pulling tight as fear and adrenaline poured through both of them. Lisa ran beside them and explained that those things were called wraiths, and they were what happened when the architects took someone and hollowed them out and filled them with purpose and hunger. Maya asked if there was any way to save them, and Lisa shook her head and said once someone was turned, they were gone, and the best mercy was to end them quickly. They reached a massive cavern that opened up beneath the desert and found structures that dwarfed anything Maya had seen, and buildings that seemed to grow from the ground like trees, and technology that blended with biology in ways that hurt to understand. This was the true Undercity, and the original settlement of whatever species had built the Eclipse Gate and lived here before humans, or Varens, ever reached the stars. Keleth led them to a building that still had power, and they barricaded the entrance and caught their breath and counted their losses. Half the resistance was dead or missing, and Varen had not made it out, and Keleth sat in a corner with her face buried in her hands, and Maya felt waves of grief through the bond that threatened to drown them. Both she went to Keleth and held her and said nothing because there were no words that could help, and the princess clung to her and shook with silent sobs. Later, when Keleth had composed herself, she explained that Varen had been preparing for this and had known he probably would not survive, and he had left instructions for accessing the deepest archives. Lisa activated the terminal, and it responded to her touch and displayed files in a format that seemed to translate itself into whatever language the reader understood. The files contained the true history of the Varen species, and Maya read with growing horror and learned that the Varens had been created as biological weapons and designed to fight something called the Void Lords, who had been consuming galaxies. The architects had been the scientists and engineers who made the Varens and gave them intelligence and power and expected obedience, but the Varens had developed free will and turned on their creators. The war that followed had nearly destroyed this entire sector of space, and the Varens had won at terrible cost and sealed the architects in a prison between dimensions. The Eclipse Gate was both lock and key and required massive energy to maintain, and the Varens had charged themselves with guarding it forever. Over millennia, the truth had been forgotten and suppressed and turned into mythology, and now the seals were weakening, and the architects were reaching through the gaps. Maya asked why humanity had been drawn to this sector, and the files showed star charts with humanity's expansion route, and it had been carefully guided by planted signals and mysterious phenomena and engineered first contact scenarios. The architects had been calling humanity here for decades and using them as tools to weaken the Varens and break the seals, and now both species were dancing to a tune neither of them could. Harkleth pulled up more files and showed Maya the specifications for the Eclipse Gate, and the device existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and required a power source that could bridge realities. The soul mark was that power source, and two beings bound together created a resonance that could anchor the gate and channel enough energy to reset the seals, but the process would consume them completely and unravel their existence across all timelines, and they would never have been born and never have lived, and reality would rewrite itself without them. Maya felt cold certainty settle in her chest and asked if there was absolutely no other. Walisa said they had been searching for alternatives for years and found nothing, and that hundreds of scientists from both species had tried to solve the problem and failed. Dashkir spoke then, and his voice filled the chamber, and he said that he had witnessed other cycles and other species who faced similar choices, and some had chosen sacrifice, and others had refused. Those who refused were consumed by the darkness. They sought to escape, and their civilizations fell into ruin, and their worlds became tomb monuments to their failure. Those who accepted the burden created ages of peace and prosperity, and their names were forgotten, but their legacy lived in every generation that came after. Maya asked the dragon if he was afraid, and Ashkire said he had lived long enough to see fear become meaningless, and that he welcomed the rest, that oblivion would brinkleth. Asked how long they had, and Lisa checked the tactical displays and said the first shots had been fired and a border station had been destroyed, and both sides were blaming the other. The cascade had begun, and within hours the main fleets would engage and billions would die in the opening salvos. Maya felt panic rising because they needed more time, and the Eclipse Gate was still days away through hostile territory of Varens. Voice crackled over the damaged communications array, and he was alive somehow and fighting a rearguard action and buying them time to escape deeper into the Underciticalith. Tried to respond, but the connection cut out, and Maya felt through the bond that her brother was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. The resistance fighters prepared to move out, and they had weapons and supplies cached throughout the Undercity from years of preparation. Lisa organized them into teams and assigned routes and rendezvous points, and looked at Maya with eyes that said she knew this was probably goodbye. They moved through the ancient city and past buildings that still functioned after eons, and streets that cleaned themselves, and displays that activated as they passed, showing scenes from the lives of those long-dead builders. Maya saw families and children playing, and lovers embracing in ordinary moments of life that could have been from any civilization, and she realized how much they all had in common. The wraiths found them again in a plaza surrounded by towers that reached toward the cavern ceiling, and this time there were hundreds, and they moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of intelligence guiding the Mashkire took to the air and strafed them with that reality-bending breath, and the resistance fighters formed a defensive line, but Maya could see they would be overwhelmed. Calith grabbed her hand and said they needed to run, and that the gate was more important than any of them. Maya did not want to leave the others, but understood, and they ran with a small group through side passages, while the sounds of battle echoed behind them. Lisa caught up to them bleeding from a head wound, and said most of the resistance was dead, and the wraiths were hunting survivors, and they needed to reach the gate immediately. Emerged into a canyon where the walls glowed with veins of energy, and the air tasted like ozone, and Kelith said they were close now. The singing canyons stretched before them, and the wind made sounds like voices, and the rocks themselves seemed alive with power. Calith explained that this was where reality became thin, and the barriers between dimensions weakened, and where the first trial of the Eclipse Gate would begin. Maya asked what the trial involved, and Calith said she did not know, and that every soul-marked pair faced different challenges, and that they would need to trust each other completely. Entered the canyons, and immediately Maya felt something shift, and the world seemed less solid, and she saw, after images of other timelines bleeding through, Kelith grabbed her
hand.
and said to focus on the bond and use it as an anchor, and Maya felt the connection between them blazing like a star. Shadows detached from the canyon walls and formed into shapes that looked like Maya and Kelith, but wrong somehow, and distorted and filled with malice. The entrance to the second trial looked like a doorway carved from starlight, and when Maya stepped through, she found herself standing in a corridor that stretched in all directions. Simultaneously, and time felt liquid and unstable. Kelith was beside her, but also seemed to be ahead and behind, and Maya felt the bond stretching across impossible distances and snapping back, and the princess reached for her hand, and their fingers interlocked, and that contact anchored them. They walked forward, and the corridor shifted, and Maya saw herself making different choices and watched timelines branch and diverge. In one vision, she never joined the military and stayed on Earth, farming the family land, and grew old, never knowing about aliens or war. Or the woman whose hand she now held in another, she died in her crashed ship, and nobody ever found her body, and the war came anyway, and billions burned in. A third timeline, she and Kelith met as enemies across a battlefield and killed each other. Without ever understanding the bond that might have existed, the visions multiplied, and Maya saw countless versions of herself and Kelith, making different choices and living different lives and dying in different ways. Some timelines showed them succeeding and reaching the gate and sacrificing themselves, in reality blossoming into an age of peace and cooperation. Others showed them refusing the burden and watching helplessly as the architects broke free and consumed everything and turned the galaxy into an empire of suffering. Kelith pulled her close and whispered that these were not mere illusions, but real possibilities existing in parallel in the labyrinth, showing them the weight of their choice. Maya asked how they were supposed to navigate this, and Kelith said they needed to choose the path where they stayed together and trust that the bond would guide them. They walked hand in hand through branching corridors, and each choice felt monumental, and Maya saw her sister Katie in some timelines happy and safe, and in others dead or corrupted into a Wraitha. Visions were designed to break them and make them doubt, and trap them in analysis paralysis where every option seemed to lead to tragedy. But Maya focused on the bond and the warmth of Kelith's hand in hers, and the steady rhythm of the princess's heartbeat that echoed through their connection. She realized that the point was not to find the perfect timeline, but to commit to one and see it through, and accept that uncertainty was part of being Kelith, understood at the same moment, and together they chose a path and walked it. Without looking back and the other timelines faded away, they emerged into a chamber where reality reasserted itself, and Lisa was waiting along with a handful of resistance fighters who looked exhausted and battered. Lisa explained that she had taken a different route and lost more people, and the Wraiths were converging on their location, and they had maybe an hour before being over. Kelith checked their position and said the Eclipse Gate was close now, and just beyond one more Barirish landed in the chamber and spoke urgently, and said he could feel the architects pushing through the weakened seals, and their influence was spreading faster than predicted. Maya asked what would happen if they failed, and the dragon showed her a vision of Wraiths overrunning both species and turning every living being into hollow puppets in the galaxy. Falling silent and dark, Lisa gave Maya a weapon and said she and the remaining resistance would hold off the Wraiths as long as possible, and that Maya and Kelith needed to reach the gate no matter what. Maya wanted to argue, but Lisa cut her off and said this was always the plan, and that every person here knew the risks and chose to come anyway. An older woman hugged Maya and said she was proud, and that Maya's parents would have been proud too, and that sometimes the greatest heroism was accepting help when it was offered. The resistance fighters moved to defensive positions and began setting charges and traps and preparing for a last stand. Kelith led Maya and Ashkire through a narrow passage that opened into a valley where the Eclipse Gate stood. The gate was not a physical structure, but a wound in space itself, and Maya could see through it to other dimensions and realities layered on top of each. Other ancient machinery surrounded the gate and hummed with power that made her bones vibrate, and the air was thick with energy that tasted like copper and ozone. Kelith explained that they needed to complete the final trial and prove they understood the price and were willing to pay. Yet the gate pulsed, and Maya felt it. Reaching into her mind and showing her what would happen, she saw herself and Keleth, standing together as the gate activated, and watched their bodies dissolve into light, and felt their consciousness unraveling. More than that, she saw the consequences of their erasure and every memory people had of them fading and rewriting itself. Katie would remember growing up as an only child and never understand the hollow feeling in her chest. When she looked at old family photos, Varen would have no sister to rebel alongside, and his life would take a different path, and he would never know what he lost. Lisa would remember training other pilots, but Maya's face would blur and fade and be replaced by someone else. The gate showed her that this was the price, and not just death, but complete removal from existence and reality itself, forgetting they had ever. Binkalith was seeing similar visions through the bond, and Maya felt the princess's terror and grief and determination all mixed together. Maya asked if there was any part of them that would remain, and the gate responded by showing her the legacy and the peace that would follow, and the lives that would be. Saved children who would grow up never knowing war, and families who would cross species lines without fear, and a galaxy united against external threats. The gate showed her Katie living to old age and having children of her own, and those children reaching for the stars with hope. Instead of weapons, it showed her Varens and humans working together and building things neither species could achieve alone, and expanding into regions of space that had been closed for eons. The vision was beautiful and terrible, and Maya understood that this was what they would become, and scattered across billions of lives as possibility and peace and potential. Keleth spoke then and asked Maya directly if she regretted the accidental kiss that bound them. Maya turned to face the princess and saw fear and love and acceptance in those otherworldly eyes, and felt the bond between them singing with resonance. She said it was the best accident of her life, and meant every word behind. Then the sounds of battle grew closer, and Lisa's voice came over the communications array saying they could not hold much longer, and that the wraiths had broken through the main defense. Keleth asked Maya if she was ready, and Maya said she would never be ready, but that she was willing. The princess smiled, and it was sad and beautiful and full of everything they would never have time to explore. They walked to the gate together, and Ashkire moved to his position, and the ancient machinery began to activate in response to their presence. Energy crackled around them, and Maya felt the bond blazing brighter than ever, and realized it had been preparing them for this moment all along. The gate required perfect synchronization and absolute trust, and Maya and Keleth had been building toward that since their first accidental contact. Keleth stopped just before the threshold and turned to Maya and said she wished they had more time. Maya agreed and said there were 1,000 things she wanted to say and experience and learn about this woman who had become the center of her world, but time was a luxury they did not have, and the wraiths were coming, and the fleets were firing, and billions were dying. Af asked if Maya was afraid, and Maya said she was terrified. The princess said she was too, and that maybe that was okay, and that being afraid but doing it anyway was what courage really meant. They kissed then, and it was nothing like the accidental first contact, but deliberate and desperate and full of everything they felt for each other. The bond exploded with sensation, and Maya felt herself dissolving into Keleth, and Keleth dissolving into her, and they were becoming one being split across two bodies behind them. The chamber doors burst open, and wraiths poured through, and Lisa and the resistance fighters fought desperately. 2 by seconds corrupted versions of Admiral Helen Carter and High Counselor Ixara led the wraiths, and their faces were twisted with hunger, and the architects influenced. Lisa fired her weapon until it overheated, and then drew a blade and fought hand to hand and screamed for Maya and Keleth to finish. Tushkire roared and unleashed his reality-bending breath and held back the tide, but even he could not stop them all. Maya felt the dragon's presence in her mind, and his acceptance and readiness. An ancient weariness that longed for Rescaleth squeezed her hand one last time, and together they stepped through the gate, and Ashkire followed, wrapping his essence around them. Both the Eclipse Gate activated fully, and Maya felt herself being pulled apart atom by atom and consciousness fracturing into infinite pieces through the bond she felt Keleth, experiencing the same, and they clung to each other across the dissolution and became a single. Point of light, the last thing Maya saw was Katie's face and her sister smiling at something. Maya would never exist to have caused the last thing she felt was Keleth's love burning bright enough to outlast oblivion then. There was light and silence and a pause that stretched across eternity and then nothing at all. Maya stood before the eclipse gate and felt time itself holding its breath, and the ancient machinery hummed with anticipation, and Keleth's hand was warm in hers and steady. Despite everything, the gate showed them one final vision, and this was not of the past or possible futures, but of the exact moment they would cease to exist, and what would replace them reality would rewrite itself smoothly and seamlessly, and people would remember the war almost happening but being averted through skilled diplomacy and mutual understanding. History books would credit unnamed negotiators and fortunate timing and the natural evolution of relations. Between species, Katie would wake up one morning and feel an inexplicable urge to call her mother, and would never understand why she felt grateful for siblings. She did not have the Starfall Citadel, would stand empty and unmapped, and eventually crumble into the mountain, and nobody would know a princess had once hidden their planning to save. The galaxy the resistance fighters scattered across a dozen worlds would forget why they started questioning their orders and would return to normal duties, confused but relieved. Even the wraiths attacking them now would collapse as the architects' influence was severed, and the corrupted individuals would have no memory of their time. As puppets, Maya watched all of this and felt herself accepting it, and understanding that this was not tragedy but transformation, and they would become the foundation. That everything else was built up. Pangolith spoke through the bond without words, and asked if Maya truly wanted this, and if she was choosing it freely without obligation or coercion. Maya answered with absolute certainty and said she was choosing it because it was right, and because the people she loved deserved a chance to live without the shadow of cosmic horror hanging over them. Princess asked what Maya regretted most, and Maya thought about all the experiences she would never have, and places she would never see, and conversations she would never finish, but mostly she regretted not having more time with Keleth and not getting to explore what they could have become together. If circumstances had been different, Keleth felt the same through the bond, and said that in another timeline maybe they met in peace and had years to learn each other and build something beautiful. Maya smiled and said maybe in that timeline they were boring and ordinary and never had to be heroes. Princess laughed and said she doubted Maya could ever be boring, and that even in a peaceful timeline she would find adventures somehow behind them. The wraiths were overwhelming the defenders, and Lisa went down fighting, and her last act was to trigger charges that collapsed part of the ceiling and bought precious second. Sashkire was tiring, and even a primordial had limits, and the dragon's movements were slowing, and his reality-bending breath was weakening. Admiral Carter, in her corrupted form, broke through and charged toward the gate, and her eyes were empty, but her body remembered military training and lethal efficiency. Keleth moved to intercept, but Maya held her back and said they needed to trust the gate and trust the process. Gate responded to their commitment, and a barrier of pure energy snapped into place, and Carter slammed into it and could not pass. The architect's voice echoed through the chamber, and it was not sound, but meaning forced directly into their minds. And it screamed rage at being denied and promised suffering if they continued. Maya felt the malice behind that voice and understood that the architects were not evil in any way she could comprehend, but rather hungry in a way that transcended morality. And they saw all living beings as food and nothing more. Keleth squared her shoulders and spoke back to the architects and said their age was ending and that new species would rise without their manipulation, and the galaxy would be better for their absence. The architects laughed and said they had existed before time and would exist after, and that sealing them away changed nothing. Skyer spoke then, and his voice carried the weight of eons, and said that changing nothing was better than the alternative, and that sometimes the greatest victory was denying the enemy what they wanted. The dragon turned to Maya and Keleth and said it had been an honor to witness their bond, and that he would carry the memory of their courage into whatever came after. Maya felt tears on her face and said she was honored to have known him, and that she hoped oblivion was kinder than existence had been. Ashkire said he suspected it would be, and that he was ready. The gate began pulling them forward, and Maya felt her body starting to dissolve, and her consciousness fragmenting into pieces that scattered across dimensions. Skeelith was dissolving beside her. And through the bond, Maya felt every moment of the princess's life, and every joy and sorrow. In triumph and failure, she saw Khalith as a child learning to fly with Ashkire and laughing with delight as they soared above mountains. She saw the princess growing into her responsibilities and feeling the weight of duty slowly crushing her spirit. Saw Khalith searching desperately for another path and refusing to accept that war was inevitable, and she saw the exact moment when Khalith decided that peace was worth any price, including her own existence. Maya shared her own memories in return, and showed Khalith growing up on Earth under wide skies and dreaming of the stars. She showed her joining the military, not for glory, but because she wanted to protect people and make a difference. She showed her the loneliness of deep space patrols, and the wonder of seeing alien worlds and the fear when her ship was torn apart, and she showed Khalith the moment their lips met accidentally and how Maya's entire world had shifted and realigned around this impossible woman they were merging now. And their separate identities were blurring, and Maya could no longer tell where she ended and Khalith began. The gate required them to become one, and they surrendered to it willingly and let go of ego and self and everything that made them individuals. That space between existing and not existing, Maya felt something unexpected, and it was joy and pure, uncomplicated happiness at what they were accomplishing. Khalith felt it too, and through their merged consciousness, they understood that this was not an ending but a transformation, and they would live on in every peaceful moment that followed. The wraiths were collapsing now, and the architects' hold was weakening, and across the galaxy fleet commanders were hesitating and wondering why they had been so eager for Warkati. Collins stood on the bridge of her destroyer and felt sudden overwhelming relief, and recommended to her captain that they stand down and pursue diplomatic channels. The captain agreed, and similar decisions were being made on hundreds of ships, and the cascade toward total war was reversing itself in the Undercity. The remaining resistance fighters felt the shift and lowered their weapons and wondered what they had been fighting for. Lisa Torres, in her final moments, felt peace and satisfaction, and died knowing somehow that the mission had succeeded. Admiral Carter collapsed as the corruption left her body, and she woke confused and traumatized. But herself, again High Counselor Nixara, experienced the same and would spend the rest of her life trying to understand what had happened and making amends for actions she barely remembered. The Eclipse Gate blazed with light that was visible across dimensions, and the seals were reinforcing and strengthening, and the architects were being pushed back into their prison. Maya and Khalith existed for one final moment as distinct beings, and they looked at each other with love and gratitude and acceptance. Elith whispered the same words she had spoken after their first kiss, and they resonated across everything they had become. Once more Maya understood and kissed her. And this time it was not accidental or desperate, but deliberate and full of everything they felt. Kiss was their final act as individuals, and their first act as something new, and they poured every bit of themselves into it. Then the gate consumed them completely, and Ashkire with them, and three souls became pure energy and rewrote reality at its most fundamental level. The light faded, and the gate sealed, and the chamber was empty, except for confused Varen soldiers who could not remember why they had been fighting in. That moment, Maya Collins and Princess Khalith and Ashkire, the primordial ceased to have ever existed timeline, rewrote itself and adjusted and smoothed over the gaps they left behind, but echoes remained, and people across the galaxy felt inexplicable gratitude when they looked at the stars. Katie Collins would sometimes dream of a sister she never had, and wake with tears on her face and overwhelming love in her heart. Commanders on both sides would make decisions that favored peace over conflict, and never understand why it felt so important. Young lovers would kiss and feel brief flashes of something cosmic and eternal and dismiss it as imagination. The soul mark left its mark on reality itself, and the bond between Maya and Keleth became woven into the fabric of existence. Years later, the human and Varen alliance celebrated an anniversary of peace that nobody could quite explain. Historians debated how two species on the brink of war had suddenly chosen cooperation and found no satisfactory answers. Caddy Collins, now an ambassador, stood before a memorial to unknown heroes and felt that familiar ache of missing someone she could not remember. She placed flowers at the base of 3 statues, whose faces had been worn smooth by time and wind. The memorial had appeared mysteriously in the years after the crisis, and nobody knew who built it or who it represented, but people came anyway and left offerings and felt strangely comforted by the presence of the 2 figures embracing in the dragon-wrapped